Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. Thank you for joining me today. So in this module, we're looking at CSS Animation, some advanced CSS Animation. So I thought, like the best thing for us to do for class here. Good morning. Hello. Thought the best thing to do for class here would just be to do some demonstration. Show some demonstration of some different types of CSS animation here for our live class today, just so you can see some more examples. And I'm going to kind of do it in context, right? Because I think that's pretty important also, is to do stuff like that. Stuff like this in context. So I have a form, or most of a form here. Right, this is the form we're going to be working on today. I kind of cooked this up before going live. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to add a button to it that's really going to take... And in the process, we're going to be reviewing some of the stuff that we covered in previous weeks. So, last week we didn't get to go live to talk about advanced CSS selectors, I think it was. Last week we were supposed to go live and talk about. We didn't get the opportunity to do that. So we'll review a little of that as a part of this as well. We'll do a little, we'll try to make it as responsive as we can. And we'll do a lot of animation here. But I've got just a little single input form field here. I don't have the button to it yet, because the button is the thing that I want to animate. And so what I'd like to do, right, just so we can kind of have a plan here, I'd like to be able to have a button. I'd like for the button itself to have some sort of hover animation on it, so that when the user takes their mouse and hovers over the button, it does something, right? And so typically we will do transforms with scale and color and maybe border for this sort of animation, just to bring attention to the fact that like the mouse is hovering over the button, right? So, it gives that, for those of you who are in Web 2.10, we talk about the affordance of clickability in there. Gives you that affordance of clickability, gives you that feedback that you've done something that you should be doing, right? Which is taking your mouse and hovering it over the button. I'd like to make this, I believe, a send button. And I'd like to do something a little bit special with it. There's a little airplane emoji. It looks kind of like, I'll do a bad drawing of it right now. There's a little airplane emoji that we can use. And so one of the things that I would like to do is that when we hover over the button, I would like to have a little airplane emoji or something like that sort of fly away, to kind of imply that, hey, when you send this button, it's going to send this. When you click this button, it's going to send this information off. So we're going to have a simple animation, a simple hover animation in how our button interacts with a hover. We're going to have a little more complex animation in terms of making this airplane fly away. And I'd also like to create a frame animation, which I think that's basically, the biggest parts of what we talk about in the module are the different animation. So we can basically take all the different animation types that we talk about and include them into one button here. So what I'd like to do is just on a loop, just maybe pulse the text of the button. Just to be like, hey, click me, click me, click me, that sort of thing that you might have seen before. Right, so we'll do a little frame animation on the button. We'll have a little complex transition on the plane to make it look like it's flying away. And we'll do a little simple transition on the button with the hover so we can make it just give a better affordance, right? So lots of different types of animation and things of that nature that we can do with a button here. The first thing I want to do, we'll pull that back in as we're working here, but the first thing I want to do is just make our button. Right, and I am going to give you all this code. We'll put it in a GitHub after we're done. So I'll put it in a GitHub and share it with you when I post the recording. So we're going to create my button. Just going to use a simple button element here. I'm going to give the button itself an ID of send. Yes, I can show you how to get it from my GitHub. Again, when I when I push this up, sure, I can do that. Yes. So we're going to put a little button element into here. And I'm going to put a span inside of this button element. And a span is a non-semantic tag. So when you think span, you can think about things like divs, things of that nature that just allow me to take parts of my code and segment them into other things. One of the things that we talked about last time, when we talked about advanced CSS selectors, in the pre-recorded video you all did last week, or watched last week, we talked about befores and afters. And so I want to use an after here to actually put my plane on my button. So this will be a span. I will give it an ID of, let's say, button-text. And we'll go ahead and put the word send in there like that. So by default, right now, we just have a little simple button here with the word send on it. We can see kind of what it looks like when I hover my mouse over it. It turns light blue. It's the standard button since we just made the button. Let's do a little bit of basic styling to this button. So all of the base template CSS for when you were reviewing the code, all the base template CSS I put in its own section, and all the animation CSS, all the stuff that we're doing in class today, I'm going to put it in its own section. So we're going to select our send button, which is going to be the hashtag send for ID send. It's going to be a width of, say, 80%, right? So it'll take up 80% of its parent container, which is that main box. We'll give it a height of, let's try like 3 rem, right? Just see what that looks like. That looks about right. We'll make the font size a little bit bigger. We'll make the font size like 1.8 rem, maybe. Try that out. Yep, that looks pretty good. And we'll go ahead and center that up. Margin 0 auto. Oh, and I would want to display block here as well, because that is an inline element instead of being a block element. So if I'm going to use the margin trick, remember, it needs to be a block element, so we need to display block. So now we have a button that looks like this. So we've got our little email form field. They click the email, they hover over, they click send, and it's ready to go. All right, so let's go ahead and add our plane. And we said we were going to try to do that with an after. So let's do hashtag send : after. And if you'll remember back to last week when we talked about befores and afters, we said that everything needed a content property. And it's in here that we're going to put our plane. Looks a little different in the browser than it does here. You know, here in this instance, it's kind of a tilted view of a top-down plane. But when we see it in the code window, it's kind of facing to the right. I'm gonna give that a little padding left as well. Let's say like 1 rem. And so now our button looks like that. All right, remember that when we use befores and afters, it puts things before or after, or before or after the element that we're adding the before after tag on. Can you make it move across the button? Yes, that is the plan. The plan is going to be to make it move across the button. That is what we're going to do. We're going to make that plane fly away. So that's going to be like the second animation that we're going to be doing. Is we're going to make that plane fly away. In fact, we can go ahead and we can probably kind of go ahead and do that first. That'd be okay. So in order for me to be able to, after you click the button, yes, you can do that too. You would have to do that with JavaScript instead of just pure CSS. So when we start to add some JavaScript in the future, we can see about how we would do that. But yeah, I'd have to basically have a click event in JavaScript to be able to. So I'd use a click event, JavaScript. It would add the class to it and do it whenever I clicked it. So yeah, that's doable, and we can do stuff like that whenever we start to add JavaScript in a few weeks. Absolutely. And I mean, you can kind of get the picture with the hover about how that would work to a degree. Right. So since I'm going to be transforming an after, I need to be able to apply a display inline block to it. If I don't add this line of code here that's saying, that we're going to do this as a display inline block, then it won't know how to respond to the transition as we're trying to do transformations down the line. So we need to make sure that we have display inline block or display block here. And since I want the plane to be next to my text, I'm going to use display inline block. So it's in a line. And so now basically what we've done is we have the foundation here to start adding some animation to our button. So let's go ahead and make the plane fly away first. That'll be a fun one to do. Or I guess let's, I mean, that's more of a, I think that's more of our advanced demo, but we can kind of do it backwards. It's fine. So what I want to do here is when I hover over the button, right? So we are learning about the pseudo selector of hover here. So my button is, actually technically this shouldn't be send, this should be button text, but I think it is the same either way. So we'll just, doesn't change the look of it, we'll just change that like that. Because button text is the span with my text in it. Send is my button. So technically what I would like to do here is I would like to say, okay, when I hover over my send button, interact with my button text after. So when I hashtag send hover, right? So that puts my CSS event in there. When I do this, I want to impact. So we'll use that sibling selector that we talked, or not sibling selector, that child selector that we discussed in the video last week to select the button text after. And so now what we do in this part of the CSS will only occur when that button is hovered over. Right? And so we can start out by just doing the transformation that we want to do. Right? So we'd add a transform property. And what we want to do is we want to translate. Translation moves across the X and Y axes. I'm just going to move it in one direction, so I'm just going to use one number here. We look at the different types of transforms in the module. In our demonstration today, we're going to use... Which different transforms are we going to use today? We're going to use scale. We're going to use translate. And I think that's it. There's also, there's also rotation. There's also rotate, which I thought about doing. It just turns things around. But let's say I want this to move 3 rem. Let's start with 3 rem here, and we can up it if it's not enough, or lower it if it's too much. And so we can save this. Now, we haven't added any sort of transition logic to it yet, right? So what it does, it's going to do quickly, and it's going to jump and do it quickly. So when I hover now, we can see the plane jump. Right? And based on the size of this, we could go a little bigger with it, right? We could say maybe 6 rem. Which is a little bit bigger of a jump. But I think we could go even bigger with it, right? This looks like it could probably go all the way to 12 rem. Even if it flies off of the side of the button, it's fine with what we have planned for it, because I don't just want to animate the button, but I also want to animate the opacity of the plane, so it kind of looks like it's disappearing into the clouds, or however you want to say it. Right, so now we can see it's kind of moving all the way across the button. And so instead, if we want to get it to just kind of fly across instead of jump like that, we would add a transition rule to our after. So that's going to be transition, transform, 2 seconds. Right, 2S for 2 seconds. So now when we hover our mouse over, it will take 2 seconds to complete that animation instead of just jumping and doing it all at once. Right, so hover my mouse and you can see it kind of glides across. Instead of just jumping and starting at point A and going to point B, it glides across my button. And you can see when I unhover, it goes back away. So I hover and it kind of glides across, and I unhover and it comes back. So we can also add an opacity transformation here that would get it to kind of disappear. So what I want to do right now is in my hover rule, I want to add an opacity. Opacity 0. I want it to be fully transparent. So opacity is, how transparent something is or isn't. In this instance, I want it to be fully transparent when the button is hovered. Right? So we haven't put a transition on it yet. But if we look at it now, we can just see it disappear. And when we unhover, we can kind of see it glide back. So we know it's happening based on what happens when we unhover. But we can see when we hover over it, it just disappears. I can add multiple rules to this transition. So I can also say, well, you're animating my opacity. So I just separate these by commas. Opacity. And you can do this for 2 seconds as well. So now it will glide across over the course of 2 seconds. And it will also disappear over the course of 2 seconds. So if I hover over now, you can kind of see it flies away. And then it comes back when I unhover. So it kind of takes off into the clouds and comes back. Right, a pretty cool little animation. To get our plane to disappear there. In general, we don't use a ton of animations, and we don't really want to overuse animations, because when you overuse animations, it can get a little tacky, right? But especially in some portfolio pieces, when you're sending them to people who are hiring managers, things like that, stuff like this can really go over really well, because they're simple things that can make a big impact. And, they also really help some design aspects as well, because, we're talking about affordances, signifiers, getting feedback, right? And animation really is a part of feedback, because I can actually visually watch something happen after I've done an action. So it's super cool that I can, get that sort of feedback from a website. So there are different reasons why we would do something like this. And I'm kind of overdoing this example today just because, I want to demonstrate the different types of animation that we're discussing. So we're getting our plane to fly off now. I also want to get our button to do a little bit more. I want the button to just get slightly bigger when I hover over it. Just a little bit bigger when I hover over it. And I want it to be a different color, right? Like this color palette that we're using here so far is, reds. Just a monochromatic red palette. When you look in my base site CSS, you'll see that I used a CSS variable to kind of set up a primary color. And then just have an HSL background color set and an HSL color set for the H1, so that I can just change the value of the variable and get a completely different color palette site. And so I'm just going to stick to this monochromatic color palette for our purposes today. Let's change it back to that red that we were using. And in this case, I am basically going to use this same type of code. I'm going to impact the button itself instead of a child of the button, right? So in this instance, I'm going to want to say, well, this is what happens to send when we hover over send. So remember that hashtag send, the ID there, that is our button. And so one of the things that I might want to do here is I might want to scale it up. So I might want to say, and that is another transform property. So we'd start with transform, scale, and we'd scale it a certain percentage. So if I want it to get bigger, it would be 100 and some odd percent. I only want it to get slightly bigger, so I'm going to go for like 103%. Right? And right now, remember, we don't have a transition property yet here on our send button. So it will jump instead of doing it gradually. So if you can kind of see there, it get just a little bit bigger when I hover over it. I can do something more dramatic to make it really apparent. Like if I said 125%, that would make the transition really dramatic. Typically we don't go this dramatic with it. We just go small. Maybe something that kind of splits the difference, maybe like 105 here. So it's a little bit bigger than 103. So it's a little bit more noticeable, but it's not crazy noticeable. And you can see even when we apply that transition to the button, the animation on our plane still works. We're also going to change the background color here. So let's change that background color. Background color of the button. We're using HSLs, and I'm using them with a variable, which is var primary color, var pri-color. Saturation, we'll say, is 80%. And lightness, we will say, is high. So let's say like 90%. Let's see what that looks like. All right, like I did some of this beforehand, but not all of it. All right, so now we have that, and it gives me that little, kind of pinkish color. Right, it's not quite pure red, because pure red would be closer to 0, so it's red with just a little bit of green in it. So it gives us that sort of, it's kind of starting to approach orange, right? Like it's thinking about starting to turn orange. And I think I want to make my border here just a little bit of a different color, because when we look at this, right, like that black border around it doesn't really fit for me, or it doesn't really work for me. So I think I might want to make that a little bit different. So I might make that the same color as our H1 text. So let's say border 2px solid HSL. Let's see, that one is the one that I'm using for the H1. So now we see it has that border color. And if we want to, right, we can kind of do some things to change the look of the button in general. Just by styling the baseline button or ID of send without the hover. I'm going to leave it just the regular old button look for the purposes of this demo. If you wanted to shadow under the plane's movement, that is possible. Let's see. And there are a couple different ways that could be done. For our purposes, we could kind of do it a simple way. Sometimes when you see things like that, it's kind of One of the ways that they do it is via like having two copies of an element. I might be able to work this out with a text shadow. So we can try something like that in this instance. If I wanted to do that, that would be on the after, and I would do it on the after on the hover. So it would only be there on the hover. So we would do a text dash shadow. Like 2 pixels, 10 pixels down, 10 pixels of blur, and we'd make it like a dark gray. Or we could also make it like a dark red. Let's try a dark gray first, just so you can kind of see the proof of concept. And I'm just kind of winging this, so we'll probably have to tweak it a little bit here. You can see the shadow kind of appear there, and it all fades away as it kind of fades out. Another way to do that would be to use like 2 different elements, and that way you could kind of control different things over the course of the transition. And another way would be JavaScript. Right, and I think you can use text shadow in a transition, because it does use values. So if I did something, so if I added like text dash shadow 1.5 seconds. Oh, I didn't like that. Oh, I forgot to put the S. That would do it. Yeah, it needs to be way quicker, looks like. Let's try like 0.5 seconds. Yeah. So it kind of puts it in there with the plane as it's kind of taken off, which is kind of cool. I might even want that to be less blurred. And let's make it like a dark red instead. Now I'm just kind of getting onto a tangent. We'll get back to it in just a minute. I've gotten interested in this shadow. Yeah, that's kind of fun. That's a fun little shadow there. And it really does kind of make it gives it that more of that 3D effect to where we're seeing it, kind of fly away. Pretty cool. let's see now, where were we? I think I wanted to add the transition to the base button, right? So it doesn't just, so it actually transitions into getting a little bit bigger instead of just jumping there. So we can add that to our send. This will be a transition. We're transitioning the transform property over the course of, say, 1 second. And we're transitioning the background color property over the course of 1 second. So now instead of getting that jump, we should get a bit of a smooth transition. Which we do. Pretty cool. So the other animation type that I wanted to demonstrate today was a frame animation. And so this basically gets our button mostly to where we want it to be for our demonstration today. I want to do a little bit of a frame animation demo as well. And what I would like to happen is to just have this text here just kind of pulse. Get a little bit bigger and just go like big, small, really quickly, like say every 10 seconds. Just to kind of remind you that it's there, right? Draw your attention to it. So even if you're not hovered over it, it's still doing a little something over here. And in order to do that, we're going to create a frame animation. And so I'm going to do this up here around what's my line 50 at the top of all of this animation CSS, just because I like to have, or really I could just do the keyframe next. I just like to have the keyframes before I put in the transition CSS, just because it's going to make it the read time better, right? Because it's doing things in order. And so for this is a keyframe animation. So I'm going to start with my at keyframes. At keyframes. So this would be like at media for our media queries that we looked at. It's kind of a special function in CSS that, you know, denotes something different than standard CSS does. So this is at keyframes, and this is establishing a set of keyframes. And so the next thing that we would need here is we'd need to be able to name this set of keyframes. And I think I want it to kind of pulse, so we'll just call it pulse. And we'll establish a set of keyframes here. And so for every keyframe animation, I'm basically looking at a timeline, right? So I have basically a beginning of my animation and an end of my animation. And I can define the fact that this animation can take place in some amount of time. So we can say 10 seconds, or 15 seconds, or a minute, 60 seconds. Right, but at different points across this timeline, I can add what we call keyframes to do a little bit of a different thing. Tell it to transition and do something just a little bit different at that point in the timeline. And so we reference these keyframes on our timeline in percentages. Right? So the first keyframe might be at 10%. And that just means when the animation is 10% finished. Right? When it's 10% finished, you should be at this point. When it's 15% finished, you should be at this point. So on and so forth, right? So I can set these different keyframes. For example, when the animation starts, so when the animation is 0% finished, I want it to just be 100%. Transform, scale, 100%. And when it's 10% finished, I might want that scale to be at 110%. So that way it goes from when the transition is, or when the animation is 0% finished, so when it's gone 0 seconds, 0 amount of time through the timeline, it's just regular size. When it's gone 10% of the amount of time through the timeline, when you hover over to change the text size or to change the text color, you would just use your standard hover pseudo selector. So if I wanted the font color of my button to change, I could just change color in the hover and have it do the same, say, same color as this. Right, so with that, I'm going to change my button color. So this is basically how we get it to do an animation all the time, whether I'm hovering or not. And you can do some things where you're adding an animation on hover, right? You just have to create your keyframes and then put the animation property inside of the hover. So there is like some fancy stuff that you could do there if you got into that. For our purposes today, the plan is to not get too far into that, but we will, if we have a little extra time, I might go ahead and demonstrate something like that. So the next thing would be, let's see, we could say, well, at 20% of the timeline, we want to shrink it back down to say 100. $30 and $40. We basically do the same thing, so it grows, it shrinks, it grows, it shrinks. Grow, shrink in a short amount of time. And then it just stays there until it's done, right? So at 100% of the timeline, it should be at 100%. So now we've created a keyframe animation, and we can add this keyframe animation as an animation to our button text. Right? And so we haven't really used our button text much yet, but I'm going to focus my button text ID selector and add this animation. And I'm going to display inline block, because whenever I want to transform anything in any sort of way, animate it in any sort of way, I want to have some sort of display on it, whether it's inline block or block. And then I'm going to add my animation, and I'm going to do that with the property animation. And so with this keyframe property, I add the name of my animation, which in this case is pulse, because that's what I named it. I tell it how long I want that timeline to be in a number of seconds. So let's say 10 seconds. I tell it to do some easing. Right? You can ease in, you can ease out, and this just kind of changes the way that it kind of flows through the animation. We talk about it. I think I talk about it a little bit in the module. But like if you think about animation as like a line, just a regular animation just goes straight from beginning to end. Whereas if I ease in, I kind of start and go up. If I ease out, I kind of start in a straight line and then go up. And if I ease in and out, I kind of do that sort of thing. Right? Or the animation for this line would probably be better as like that. And then that. Right? So it just kind of changes the flow a little bit, makes it a little nicer, it looks a little more natural. So I might use ease in, out here. And if I want it to loop forever, I can just say that it is infinite. If I want it to do a certain number of times, if I only wanted to go once, we can put that information here as well, but I can just say, well, it's infinite. So now, you can see it there, right? It just, every 10 seconds, it just does that quick pulse. And that's kind of a slow pulse. We might want to make that a little bit faster. You can see the text just kind of get big, small, and then just rest for a little while. If we wanted that to happen faster, we would just change our percentages on our timeline. So if we wanted it to happen like real fast, just boom, boom, we'd change it to like 3, 6, 9, 12, and then have that go all the way out to 100. Right? So now at 3% of the timeline, 6% of the timeline, 9% of the timeline, 12% of the timeline, and then all the way to the end. Right, so now if we look at that, we see it just kind of does it really quickly, 2 times. Vroom, vroom. And if we wait long enough, we'll see it do it again. There it goes. It'll just kind of do that forever, just kind of reminding you like, hey, buttons here. Don't forget buttons here. And I like to have the pause built in there just so it's not doing it all the time. And it's, since we didn't scale it really big here, it's kind of subtle. And we can just kind of see it. And the rest of our transition and stuff still works. Even if we have it hovered over and haven't clicked it yet, it still does its thing. So it's like, hey, kind of like, why don't you click? Hey, click me. Right, which is pretty cool. So we've got a lot of different types of animation on this button here now. Let's do a little bit of I think we do have a little bit of time. So if we wanted to do, say, like a secret animation here, so we could do kind of a secret color change. Right, because for example, like we have this paragraph here. have this paragraph, which is the submit your email below. Buttons and links aren't the only thing that we can hover over, right? So if we select our paragraph element selector, use the hover, and said color red, and we hovered over that paragraph, it's going to turn it to red, right? We just can't click on it to do anything. So we can do kind of a bit of an Easter egg animation to where we can change the color of that text when we're hovered over it, and we can actually do sort of rainbow colors here. So if we said at keyframes, rainbow, call it rainbow, now we can just put different colors in at different percentage points of our timeline. So maybe at 0%, it will be color black. At 10%, it'll be color red. At 20%, color blue. 30%, color yellow. 40%, we'll do color green. And we'll just kind of fill this up with colors. Violet. Purple. And then let's just go 80% to 100%. We'll just do color black again. Now, if I only wanted this animation to play when it's hovered over, I would just put the animation inside of the element with the hover pseudo selector. So we would say animation, rainbow, 8 seconds, infinite. And so if we hover here, you can see it just cycles through the rainbow of colors of our paragraph. And that's kind of a, now it's kind of a little Easter egg animation that we've built into our form here. And then when I unhover, it just goes back to black. Even if I hovered early, even if I unhovered early, it just goes back to black. So now we have a little secret animation built in. All right. That's pretty cool. Let me go ahead and push this up really quickly. This is actually already in a folder that is being get monitored, right? We said early on we'd have one Git repo for this, and we would get add period git commit -m animation demo added. git push origin master. So since it's already being tracked on Git from the last demonstration that we did, I just have to add, commit, and push. So let's go to GitHub. Let me pull up my GitHub here. We'll do that in another window. Find this repo. Which is the Web 215 Fa23. And so this has our responsive web development demonstration we did a couple weeks ago. It has the bootcamp demonstration we did back at the start of class, and it has the animation demonstration that we did today. There's our index for that. There's our style sheet for that. It should already have the GitHub pages. It doesn't have GitHub pages set up for it yet. So we'll need to set up GitHub pages for that so you can see a live version of the site and play with it. Remember that I'm going to send you 3 links for this. Okay, I'm going to send you the link to this base repository. So if you want to, you can clone it and play with it, right? You just use fork. I can't fork because it's my repo, but you'd fork it into yours. And then you can do a git clone command using this URL. That would be on yours. Or if you wanted to, you can do direct downloads here if you just download zip. But again, I do kind of prefer you all practicing your Git if at all able, if you're at all able. And you can make your changes. You can make a new branch. You can push them back if you want to try that. Just start off fork. Navigate to your file. So I'll just do this in a different folder here. You want to make sure you're in the right folder in your bash or your command line interface. Run git clone and the URL that you get after you fork it. And it'll make a copy of that folder on your local machine. So I'll give you the URL to the base repo, the URL inside of the animation folder specifically, and the URL to the live pages, which I'll need to add animation to. So you can see it and play with it. But that takes us to our hour, and I think we made something kind of cool for our hour today while we were talking about CSS animations. Got a couple good examples of hover animations here. And got a couple good examples of keyframe animations. Subtle things that just add a little bit of pizzazz and a little bit of life to websites. So that's all that I have for you for today. We'll hold just a moment in case there are any questions. Sure thing. Thank you for joining me. We'll send all of this stuff out with the recording. If you think of any questions later, feel free to let me know as you're watching the recording. For those of you, will be watching the recording later. If you just think of a question in general, let me know. And we'll do our best to answer it. With that being said, that's all that I have for you for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.